In late December 1944, as Hitler launched his massive winter offensive in the Ardennes, a toxic rumor ripped through the highest levels of the Allied command. Word reached General Dwight D. Eisenhower that British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery had allegedly dismissed the American soldiers fighting in the freezing snow as cowards. The fragile Anglo-American alliance was suddenly on the verge of fracturing from within during the bloodiest battle of the Western Front. If this explosive remark was true, and if it leaked to the press, the coalition could collapse just as German tanks were breaking through the American lines. The Battle of the Bulge is primarily remembered as a brutal, snowbound clash of armor and infantry. But behind closed doors at Supreme Headquarters, the German offensive triggered the ultimate stress test for coalition warfare. While thousands of exhausted American soldiers were bleeding to hold the shattered lines in the freezing forests of Bastogne and Saint-Vith, a bitter political conflict was erupting in the safety of the rear echelons. The documented origins of this diplomatic nightmare reveal a command structure pushed to the absolute brink. Driven by the rapidly deteriorating tactical situation and the sheer toxicity of the rumors, Dwight Eisenhower sat down to draft a definitive message to the combined chiefs of staff in Washington and London. The Supreme Commander was fully prepared to demand the immediate dismissal of Britain's most celebrated field marshal, effectively forcing his political superiors to choose between himself and Montgomery. This crisis was not merely a clash of difficult personalities. It was a dangerous intersection of extreme battlefield exhaustion, intensely fragile egos, and the corrosive effects of psychological warfare. The Anglo-American alliance was entirely dependent on mutual trust, and a total breakdown at the highest level of command threatened to achieve exactly what German panzer divisions could not. Understanding how close the coalition came to collapsing requires looking past post-war memoirs and examining the raw, frantic communications of December 1944. Did Bernard Montgomery genuinely insult the courage of the American troops dying in the Ardennes snow? Or was this devastating narrative carefully amplified by a darker force actively manipulating a strained Allied command? The crisis that would push the alliance to the breaking point did not begin in a briefing room, but in the freezing, impenetrable fog of the Ardennes forest on the morning of December 16, 1944. Three German armies comprising over 400,000 men and 1,000 tanks smashed into the thinly held American lines. Achieving complete tactical surprise, the German 5th and 6th Panzer Armies ripped a massive bleeding hole straight through the center of the 1st United States Army. The sheer speed and violence of the armored assault overwhelmed the forward positions in a matter of hours. Artillery positions were overrun, supply depots were captured, and tens of thousands of American infantrymen were suddenly isolated behind enemy lines, fighting desperate, fragmented battles in the snow. Almost immediately, the physical reality of the German breakthrough destroyed the Allied command and control infrastructure. The German advance created a massive geographic wedge, eventually plunging 60 miles deep and 50 miles wide into the American sector. This salient, or bulge, severed the critical north-south communication lines. Telephone and telegraph cables were physically shredded by tank treads and artillery fire. Heavy winter storms grounded Allied aircraft and played havoc with radio transmissions, while German commandos operating behind the lines ambushed the dispatch riders trying to carry physical maps and orders between headquarters. By December 19th, this geographic reality presented Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower with a paralyzing tactical problem. General Omar Bradley, the commander of the U.S. 12th Army Group, was headquartered in Luxembourg City, on the southern flank of the massive German penetration. However, the bulk of Bradley's forces, specifically General Courtney Hodge's 1st Army and General William Simpson's 9th Army, were trapped on the northern shoulder of the Bulge. Bradley was entirely cut off from his northern commands. He could not visit them, he could not establish secure communications with them, and he could not effectively coordinate their defense. The northern shoulder was buckling, units were falling back in chaos, and the overall American command structure was effectively paralyzed by the geography of the battlefield. Sitting in the map room at Supreme Headquarters in Versailles, Eisenhower recognized that a catastrophic collapse was imminent if the northern lines were not immediately stabilized. A command restructuring was not just necessary, it was a matter of basic survival. Acting on the urgent recommendation of his intelligence chief, Eisenhower made a ruthless, pragmatic, and highly controversial decision. On December 20th, he picked up the secure telephone line to Luxembourg City and informed General Bradley that he was stripping him of command over his own northern forces. Eisenhower formally transferred operational control of the American 1st and 9th Armies to British Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery, commander of the 21st Army Group, who was safely positioned on the northern side of the salient with intact communication lines and reserve armored divisions. Militarily, it was the only logical solution to restore cohesion to a shattered front. Politically, it was a localized earthquake that immediately sent shockwaves of resentment through the American officer corps. To understand the explosive reaction of the American generals, one must look at the profound doctrinal chasm between how the two nations waged war and, more importantly, how Bernard Montgomery conducted himself. Montgomery was Britain's most celebrated soldier, the victor of El Alamein, but his military philosophy was the exact antithesis of the American doctrine. Montgomery was fiercely methodical. He believed in the set-piece battle, refusing to move or strike until every single logistical detail was perfectly aligned, every reserve unit was in place, and the battlefield was completely mathematically balanced. He was incredibly cautious, highly reluctant to take casualties, and viewed warfare as a tightly controlled, deeply sanitized exercise in industrial management. To Montgomery, the fluid, chaotic, improvisational style of the Americans was not just reckless, it was utterly unprofessional. Conversely, American commanders like Omar Bradley and George Patton operated on a doctrine of relentless forward momentum, calculated risk, and aggressive mobility. They believed in seizing the initiative, exploiting gaps, and maintaining pressure even when logistics were strained. To the Americans, Montgomery's obsessive caution translated to a maddening slowness that allowed the enemy time to regroup. They respected his intellect, but they deeply despised his arrogance. This toxic clash of cultures materialized the moment Montgomery assumed command of the American Northern Forces. When the Field Marshal arrived at the 1st Army headquarters, he did not come as a sympathetic ally offering a lifeline to a battered partner. He strode in with a swagger that instantly alienated the exhausted American staff. According to those present, Montgomery entered the command post like Christ cleansing the temple. He viewed the American situation as a disorganized, panicked mess that required adult supervision. He openly treated General Courtney Hodges, a man who had not slept in days and was bordering on physical collapse, with a staggering level of condescension. Montgomery even refused to eat the food provided by the American mess, insisting on bringing his own rations and tea, visually separating himself from the men he was now commanding. Montgomery immediately began issuing orders that made perfect tactical sense on a map, but felt like a deep betrayal to the men bleeding on the ground. He ordered immediate withdrawals to shorten and tidy up the defensive lines. Most controversially, he ordered the evacuation of the St. Vit salient, a vital crossroads where the American 7th Armored and 106th Infantry Divisions had fought a horrific, desperate holding action, buying the entire Allied Army precious days with their lives. To Montgomery, pulling back from St. Vit was basic military geometry. The salient was too exposed, and holding it was mathematically unsound. To the American generals, giving up ground that had just been purchased with thousands of American casualties was a cowardly heresy. Every tactical decision Montgomery made to stabilize the front was accompanied by lectures on proper military organization, delivered in a sharp, patronizing tone that infuriated the American staff. Word of this treatment rapidly filtered down the chain of command and across the Bulge to the southern flank, where Bradley and Patton were launching their own counterattacks. For the exhausted U.S. commanders taking horrific casualties in the freezing snow, Montgomery's methodical rescue operation felt less like a tactical salvation and more like a deliberate, humiliating subjugation. This boiling resentment among the American officer corps created the perfect tinderbox, waiting for a single spark to ignite an Allied mutiny. The simmering tension within the high command finally erupted, not on the freezing battlefields of the Ardennes, but in front of a bank of microphones at a disastrous, highly publicized press conference on January 7, 1945. By the first week of January, the worst of the German offensive had been blunted. The American lines had held. General George Patton's Third Army had relieved the besieged defenders of Bastogne, and the Allied forces were slowly grinding the German salient backward. Sensing that the crisis had passed, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery decided to hold a press briefing at his headquarters in Zonhoven, Belgium. His stated intention was actually positive. He wanted to project absolute Allied confidence. calm the jittery British public, and publicly emphasize the solidarity between British and American forces. However, Montgomery's phrasing during the briefing was spectacularly, almost catastrophically tone-deaf. Wearing his trademark beret and speaking with his usual clipped professorial cadence, he stood before the International Press Corps and proceeded to describe the Battle of the Bulge as if it were an unruly classroom he had been forced to discipline. He described the initial German breakthrough as a confusing, disorganized mess, stating that as soon as Eisenhower handed him command of the northern flank, he immediately deployed British reserves to seal the breach. He spoke of bringing the American forces under his control, using phrases like, "I employed the whole available power of the British group of armies," and "I brought it into play with a bang." He continued by explaining how he had tidied up the chaotic battlefield, reorganizing the battered American divisions with superior British tactical sense. To the reporters scribbling furiously in their notebooks, Montgomery made it sound as if he had single-handedly rescued the disorganized, panicking Americans from total annihilation. While he did include sentences praising the bravery of the American infantry, the overwhelming narrative of his speech was one of British salvation. He painted a picture of a massive, uncoordinated American disaster that only his brilliant, methodical leadership was able to correct. It was an astonishing lack of diplomatic tact, delivered directly into the notebooks of reporters eager for a dramatic headline. The massive disconnect between Montgomery's intended message of Allied unity and the patronizing reality of his actual words created an immediate diplomatic crisis. Before the Allied press could even fully digest the speech, let alone print it, German military intelligence units monitoring the radio broadcasts intercepted the raw transcripts of the press conference. Sitting in their listening posts, German psychological warfare officers recognized an unprecedented, potentially war-winning opportunity. They saw immediately that Montgomery's arrogant phrasing was the perfect weapon to finally destroy the fragile coalition from the inside. The German intelligence officers did not simply file the intercepted transcript of the press conference into an archive. They immediately recognized it as a weapon of mass psychological destruction. But even before the enemy could fully weaponize the field marshal's words, a mutated, highly toxic version of the speech was already tearing through the American lines like a secondary infection. To understand how a single press briefing in a Belgian field tent nearly destroyed the Allied coalition, one must look at the specific, catastrophic environment in which the information was received. In the chaotic, shattered landscape of the Ardennes in late December and early January, the flow of official information had entirely collapsed. The massive German armored thrust had physically destroyed the nervous system of the American First Army. Thousands of miles of copper telephone and telegraph wire had been shredded by artillery barrages and tank treads. Relay stations were overrun, and heavy winter storms were playing havoc with standard radio frequencies. In this paralyzing communications vacuum, the primary currency of the front line became rumors, carried laterally across the frozen road networks by exhausted dispatch riders, retreating infantrymen, and stressed supply truck drivers. When the initial reports of Bernard Montgomery's January 7th press conference began to filter into the American field headquarters, they did not arrive as a complete, nuanced transcript. They arrived as fragmented, second-hand summaries, stripped of any diplomatic context and heavily filtered through a pre-existing lens of intense national resentment. For months, following the grinding attrition of the Normandy campaign and the disastrous failure of Operation Market Garden, a profound bias against Montgomery had been taking root in the American officer corps. They already viewed him as intolerably arrogant, overly cautious, and entirely too eager to claim credit for American blood spilled on the battlefield. Therefore, when the fragments of his speech reached the command posts of the United States First and Third Armies, the officers did not read the words objectively. In their minds, Montgomery's patronizing tone and his claims of single-handedly rescuing the American northern flank easily and instantly morphed into an explicit, unforgivable insult. The phantom quote that began to spread like wildfire, a quote that Montgomery never technically uttered, but which his arrogant phrasing heavily implied, was that American soldiers were cowards. The rumor stated that the field marshal had told the international press that American troops had broken, panicked, and run away under the pressure of the German assault, and that the superior British army had been forced to step in to save them from a complete and humiliating rout. For the American staff officers, this was not just a breach of military protocol. It was a visceral, personal betrayal. These were men who had not slept in weeks. They were surviving on black coffee and adrenaline, staring at map boards covered in red arrows that pointed deeper and deeper into their own rear echelons. They had spent the last 3 weeks orchestrating desperate holding actions, coordinating artillery barrages while completely surrounded, and watching their own units suffer staggering, unprecedented casualties. They felt, with intense justification, that they had stabilized the front line with American blood and American tactical ingenuity. To be told that the Supreme Command now viewed them as an incompetent, cowardly liability pushed the entire command structure to the edge of a psychological cliff. The resentment was no longer a theoretical clash of military doctrines regarding the speed of an advance or the width of a front. It had become deeply, intensely toxic. Embedded within these furious American command posts were British liaison officers. These men, operating under the highly classified Phantom Network and regular Supreme Headquarters staff assignments, were specifically tasked with ensuring smooth, friction-free communication between the coalition partners. They were seasoned, pragmatic officers who understood the vital necessity of Allied cooperation. Suddenly, they found themselves thrust into a spectacularly hostile environment. They became the physical representatives of a man the Americans now openly and actively despised. The liaisons watched in mounting horror as the command climate deteriorated from professional frustration to open, borderline mutinous hostility. The atmosphere inside the headquarters of General Omar Bradley, the commander of the 12th Army Group, was particularly venomous. Bradley, normally known as the mild-mannered and deeply pragmatic GI's general, reached his absolute breaking point. He had already endured the profound professional humiliation of having 2 of his 3 armies stripped away from him by Eisenhower and handed over to Montgomery at the height of the crisis. He had swallowed that bitter pill for the sake of tactical necessity, but facing the perceived public insult of his men's courage in front of the global press corps, Bradley's legendary patience simply shattered. Surrounded by his fiercely loyal staff, Bradley made a fateful private declaration that shook the British observers to their core. He stated unequivocally that he would resign his commission, surrender his command, and return to the United States rather than serve permanently under the command of Bernard Montgomery. This was not the idle venting of an exhausted general. It was a definitive line in the sand drawn by the senior American field commander in Europe. The British liaison officers immediately realized the terrifying arithmetic of the situation. If Omar Bradley resigned over this insult, George Patton, who already loathed Montgomery with a fiery passion, would almost certainly follow. General Courtney Hodges of the First Army would likely join them. It would trigger a cascade of resignations across the senior American officer corps. The British observers scrambled to their encryption machines. They bypassed the normal, slower chains of command and dispatched frantic, highly classified back-channel warnings directly to London and to Montgomery's own tactical headquarters. Their cables painted a grim picture. The coalition was not merely bending under the pressure of the German offensive, it was actively snapping. The American generals were preparing to burn the entire command structure to the ground. The liaisons warned their superiors that the damage Montgomery had done, with a few incredibly poorly chosen phrases in a Belgian field tent, was threatening to achieve a strategic, catastrophic collapse of the Allied war effort, a collapse that the German military had utterly failed to accomplish with 400,000 men and 1,000 tanks. And precisely as the Allied High Command began to tear itself apart from the inside, the German military intelligence apparatus made its move. The enemy was not merely a passive observer to this diplomatic disaster. German psychological operations units, known as Scorpion, had been actively monitoring Allied radio traffic, unencrypted logistical transmissions, and press broadcasts since the first artillery shells fell on December 16th. These units were staffed by experts in linguistic manipulation, specifically trained to identify fractures in enemy morale and exploit them with surgical, devastating precision. When the German listening posts intercepted the raw feeds of Montgomery's press conference, they did not believe their luck. They saw immediately that they had been handed the perfect psychological wedge. They did not just replay the field marshal's speech, they meticulously weaponized it. Operating from mobile broadcasting trucks hidden deep in the freezing forests of the German rear and utilizing powerful transmitters designed to punch through the heavy winter static, the German PSYOPs teams began beaming a carefully crafted narrative directly to the front lines. They targeted the specific radio frequencies they knew the Americans were monitoring, using captured American equipment and English-speaking broadcasters who possessed perfect American accents. They mimicked the cadence and style of the Armed Forces radio network. Sometimes they would play popular American big band music, like Glenn Miller or Bing Crosby, to draw the lonely, freezing soldiers in before abruptly cutting to their poisoned news bulletins. They took the kernel of Montgomery's arrogant phrasing and amplified it into a massive, explicit lie. The German broadcasters fabricated quotes explicitly stating that Field Marshal Montgomery had called the American infantry weak, undisciplined, and cowardly. They broadcasted fabricated reports detailing how British troops were sitting comfortably in warm reserve billets, drinking tea and laughing at the Americans, while the GIs were being deliberately and ruthlessly sacrificed in the snow. They told the American soldiers that their own high command despised their fighting spirit and considered them inferior second-class troops. The goal of this operation was brilliant in its sheer malice. It was designed to convince the exhausted, freezing American soldier, huddled in a foxhole with frozen boots and dwindling ammunition, that he was fighting a two-front war, a ruthless enemy in front of him, and a treacherous, aristocratic ally behind his back. This was not a blunt instrument of propaganda. It was a psychological scalpel. The German command understood the doctrine of cognitive dissonance. They knew that if they could induce even a fraction of the American defenders to question the validity of their orders, to hesitate in a crucial moment, or to surrender out of pure disgust and feelings of betrayal, the stalled German armored offensive might suddenly regain its lost momentum. They were actively using Montgomery's ego to engineer an American mutiny in the trenches, 200 miles away, inside the heavily guarded, opulent confines of the Trianon Palace Hotel in Versailles. The crushing weight of these converging, catastrophic crises finally landed squarely on the desk of the Supreme Allied Commander, General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower was already a man operating on the absolute bleeding edge of human endurance. He was managing a logistical nightmare of terrifying, almost incomprehensible proportions. The sheer administrative burden of the Winter War was staggering. Eisenhower was attempting to funnel millions of gallons of aviation fuel, tens of thousands of tons of heavy artillery shells, and critical winter clothing over frozen, shattered, and heavily congested road networks to keep his armies from freezing and starving in the field. The famed Red Ball Express supply convoy system had reached its physical limit. The great deep-water port of Antwerp, while captured, was under constant bombardment by German V-1 and V-2 rockets, severely disrupting the vital supply chain. Eisenhower was surviving on a lethal combination of chain-smoked cigarettes and black coffee, dealing with the constant grinding pressure of halting the most massive enemy offensive in the West since the fall of France. His blood pressure was dangerously high, and his legendary diplomatic patience was entirely depleted. When the intelligence reports regarding the mutinous atmosphere in Omar Bradley's camp reached him, followed immediately by the intercepted transcripts of Montgomery's disastrous press conference and the horrific reports of German propaganda broadcasts exploiting the exact same words, Eisenhower reached his absolute limit. For years, the Supreme Commander had carefully, painstakingly managed the massive, fragile egos of his subordinate commanders. He had placated Montgomery's constant demands for overall ground command. He had stroked George Patton's immense vanity and protected him from the press. He had constantly played the mediator, the diplomat, and the politician, all to keep the fragile Anglo-American alliance moving in the same direction toward Berlin. But this crisis was fundamentally different. This was not a private disagreement over military doctrine or a dispute over the allocation of fuel. It was a very public, highly toxic disaster that directly threatened the operational integrity of the entire war effort. Eisenhower realized, with cold, pragmatic clarity, that he could no longer command a divided army. The time for gentle mediation, compromise, and diplomatic soothing had passed. The alliance was actively bleeding to death from a self-inflicted wound, and drastic, unprecedented amputation was the only remaining cure. Sitting alone in his office, feeling the immense, crushing gravity of the moment, Eisenhower picked up a pen and began drafting a highly classified message directed to the combined chiefs of staff, the supreme military authority consisting of General George Marshall in Washington and Field Marshal Alan Brooke in London. The language of the draft was devoid of any of Eisenhower's usual diplomatic softening. It was a blunt, unequivocal, and incredibly dangerous ultimatum. In the draft, Eisenhower explicitly stated that the friction within the command structure
had reached a point of total failure. He declared that it was now functionally impossible for him to work with Bernard Montgomery. The letter did not ask for mediation, it demanded action. Eisenhower demanded that the British Field Marshal be immediately relieved of his command of the 21st Army Group and replaced by someone who could function within a coalition. The political weight of this document was staggering.
It was the nuclear option of alliance politics. Eisenhower was effectively forcing his political superiors, including Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt, to make an impossible, potentially war-ending choice right in the middle of a massive, unresolved battle. They had to either fire Britain's greatest, most popular war hero, or they had to accept the resignation of the supreme Allied commander. It was an all-or-nothing gamble that could have easily destroyed the political foundation of the Second World War. While the generals waged their bitter, incredibly high-stakes war of egos in warm headquarters, and while Eisenhower painstakingly drafted the letter that could dismantle the coalition, a profoundly different, terrifyingly physical reality was playing out down in the freezing mud, shattered timber, and deep snow of the Ardennes. The sheer, petty absurdity of the political crisis at Supreme Headquarters was completely eclipsed by the unimaginable brutality of the actual war being fought by the men on the ground. Down in the trenches, the American infantrymen were entirely unaware of the diplomatic earthquake happening above them. They were men of the 101st Airborne Division, completely surrounded, cut off, and lacking winter clothing in the shattered, burning ruins of Bastogne. They were the men of the 7th Armored Division, fighting a desperate, incredibly bloody withdrawal at the vital crossroads of St. Vite and Manhay. These soldiers had not heard Montgomery's press conference. They were not listening to the frantic political back-channeling of the British liaisons. They were entirely, utterly focused on the brutal mechanics of minute-to-minute survival. They were huddled in ice-filled foxholes, their boots literally frozen to their feet, suffering from severe trench foot and frostbite. Their heavy M1 Garand rifles and machine guns were jamming in the sub-zero temperatures, requiring them to manually cycle the actions. And yet, these were the very men who were systematically, violently dismantling the entire premise of the cowardice insult with every passing hour. When the massive steel hulls of German Tiger and Panther tanks materialized out of the freezing winter fog, accompanied by waves of white-clad German infantry, these exhausted, undersupplied American soldiers did not break, and they did not run. They fought a brutal, intimate war of inches. They dug M1 anti-tank mines into the freezing mud under the cover of darkness. They used bazooka rockets at point-blank range, knowing the projectiles would often bounce harmlessly off the thick frontal armor of the German heavy tanks, forcing them to maneuver to the sides and rear while under heavy machine gun fire. American forward observers deliberately called down massive, time-on-target artillery barrages dangerously close to their own positions, sometimes directly on top of themselves, simply to halt the overwhelming momentum of the panzer assaults. They were fighting a masterful, if desperate, elastic defense. They used the dense forest, the freezing mud, and the narrow choke points of the Ardennes road network to bleed the German offensive of its most critical, irreplaceable resource, time. The massive disconnect was stark, almost sickening. The men bleeding and dying in the snow were saving the front line through pure, unadulterated tactical grit and an unbreakable resolve. They were wholly unaware that their immense physical sacrifices, their bravery, and their suffering were being actively questioned, manipulated, and weaponized by both their allies and their enemies hundreds of miles away. They were holding the very line that the generals were threatening to tear apart in a fit of injured pride. But their profound tactical success on the freezing ground could not stop the political avalanche tumbling down from the high command. Back at Supreme Headquarters in Versailles, the point of absolute no return had finally been reached. The draft of Montgomery's termination was finished. It sat on Eisenhower's desk, a single piece of paper that carried the terrifying weight of the entire war. Knowing that transmitting this cable to Washington and London would immediately ignite a political firestorm that could irreparably destroy the alliance, Eisenhower made one final, definitive move. With the drafted ultimatum in hand, the Supreme Commander's Chief of Staff walked out into the freezing French winter, boarded a waiting transport plane and prepared to deliver a final, brutal message directly to the British Field Marshal. As the transport plane carrying Eisenhower's chief of staff hammered through the freezing winter sky toward Montgomery's tactical headquarters, the entire Anglo-American alliance teetered on the edge of collapse over a single, supposedly unforgivable insult. The American High Command was ready to mutiny because they believed the British Field Marshal had publicly called their bleeding infantrymen cowards. But a meticulous analysis of primary documents, original stenographer notes, and surviving BBC audio recordings of the January 7th press conference reveals a staggering historical irony. There is absolutely no legitimate record of Bernard Montgomery ever using the word cowards to describe American troops. In fact, the unedited transcript shows that Montgomery explicitly praised the American GI, describing them as brave fighting men who fought like tigers. The catastrophic diplomatic meltdown was not triggered by a factual insult, but by a masterclass in unintentional miscommunication, rooted deeply in Montgomery's staggering lack of emotional intelligence. When he stood before the international press, he spoke exclusively in the cold, sanitized language of battlefield geometry and British institutional superiority. He lacked the basic diplomatic empathy to realize that when he described tidying up the front and deploying British armor with a bang, it sounded to an exhausted American audience exactly like a pompous aristocrat lecturing failing students. He did not explicitly call the Americans cowards, but his unadulterated arrogance left a massive tonal vacuum. That vacuum was brilliantly weaponized. German psychological operations simply took Montgomery's patronizing tone, injected the explicit word coward into their forged radio broadcasts, and let the toxic rumor run wild across shattered American communication lines. For the Allied High Command, the deeper realization was far more terrifying than any German armored breakthrough. The undeniable, chilling truth was that the factual accuracy of the quote did not matter at all. The real danger to the alliance was that American commanders like Omar Bradley and George Patton were perfectly primed and entirely willing to believe the absolute worst about their British counterpart without verifying the source. Months of accumulated resentment, ideological clashes over strategy, and bruised national egos had completely destroyed the institutional trust required for coalition warfare. By the time the actual transcripts could be physically delivered to the American command posts to clear Montgomery's name, the structural damage was already done. The phantom quote had become an operational reality in the minds of the men leading the counterattack. The truth had been entirely outpaced by anger. Eisenhower's ultimatum was already descending toward the British camp, forcing a final showdown where the Supreme Commander would have to choose between keeping his top British strategist or saving the fractured morale of the United States Army. The freezing headwinds battered the transport plane as it descended toward Field Marshal Montgomery's tactical headquarters at Zonhoven. Stepping out onto the icy tarmac was Lieutenant General Walter Bedell Smith, Eisenhower's notoriously blunt and ulcer-ridden chief of staff. Smith was not a diplomat, and he had not been sent to Belgium to negotiate. He was Eisenhower's designated hatchet man, and he was carrying the political equivalent of a live grenade. When Smith entered the British command post, he found Montgomery still largely oblivious to the sheer scale of the institutional earthquake he had just triggered. The field marshal was entirely focused on the geometry of the Ardennes battlefield, confident in his own operational brilliance. But Smith immediately stripped away the tactical maps and delivered a brutal dose of political reality. He informed Montgomery that General Omar Bradley had explicitly threatened to resign his commission, that the American 1st and 3rd Armies were on the verge of open revolt, and that the entire coalition command structure was actively disintegrating because of his press conference. Montgomery attempted to brush off the American reaction as an emotional overreaction, a temporary flare-up of exhausted officers. But Smith stopped him cold. He revealed the ultimate, terrifying truth. Sitting on the Supreme Commander's desk at Versailles was a finalized, highly classified cable addressed to the combined chiefs of staff in Washington and London. Smith looked the field marshal in the eye and delivered the ultimatum. Eisenhower was transmitting a demand for Montgomery's immediate termination as commander of the 21st Army Group. The Supreme Commander was putting his own 5 stars on the table, forcing Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt to make an agonizing zero-sum choice in the middle of a massive winter battle. The message from Eisenhower was absolute. It is him or it is me. For the first time in the entire war, the impenetrable armor of Bernard Montgomery's ego cracked. The sheer gravity of Smith's words triggered a sudden, chilling realization. Montgomery had always operated under the unshakable belief that he was militarily indispensable to the Allied cause. Now, staring at Eisenhower's chief of staff, he recognized that his legendary arrogance had finally eclipsed his tactical value. He was quite literally hours away from being sacked in absolute disgrace, permanently stripped of his command, and exiled back to Britain while the armies he had built marched into Germany without him. Faced with total professional annihilation, the field marshal was forced into a humiliating psychological retreat. The ultimate clash between his immense ego and his duty to the war effort reached its breaking point. And duty, coupled with a desperate instinct for career survival, won. All of his usual patronizing bluster vanished. Realizing that a verbal apology would never survive the toxic atmosphere of Supreme Headquarters, Montgomery immediately reached for his pen. He hastily drafted a direct, intensely personal letter to Eisenhower. The tone of the document was jarringly uncharacteristic for Britain's most celebrated soldier. It was entirely stripped of his usual lectures and conditions. It was the desperate plea of a man who suddenly realized he was standing on the gallows. Montgomery explicitly assured Eisenhower of his absolute loyalty, begging him not to tear the command structure apart. To seal his total capitulation, the fiercely proud field marshal signed the letter with a phrase he had never used before, explicitly identifying himself as Eisenhower's very devoted subordinate. The physical letter was immediately handed over, bypassing the frozen telegraph wires, and rushed back into the winter sky toward France. The entire fate of the Western Front now depended on the speed of a single aircraft. Hundreds of miles away in Versailles, Dwight Eisenhower sat behind his desk in the Trianon Palace, his hand physically resting near the finalized termination order, waiting for a reason not to pull the trigger on the alliance. When the courier finally reached the Trianon Palace and handed Montgomery's hastily written letter across the desk, Dwight Eisenhower found his reason. Reading the unprecedented words of capitulation from Britain's notoriously arrogant field marshal, specifically the closing line where Montgomery pledged himself as a very devoted subordinate, was enough. The immense tension that had been suffocating the Allied high command for weeks finally broke. With a pragmatic exhale, Eisenhower set aside the drafted ultimatum that would have demanded Montgomery's dismissal. He accepted the apology, choosing the survival of the fragile coalition over a devastating public reckoning. The immediate political crisis evaporated almost exactly as the winter weather finally cleared over Belgium, allowing Allied air power to shatter the stalled German armored columns and effectively seal the fate of Hitler's Ardennes offensive. But sweeping the diplomatic disaster under the rug could not erase the profound structural damage it had inflicted on the Anglo-American relationship. The explosive rumor of Montgomery's insult eventually faded from the front pages, but the psychological scars it left on Allied trust lingered bitterly all the way to the final victory in Europe. American generals like Omar Bradley never fully forgave what they perceived as British condescension, and British officers remained quietly resentful of American sensitivity. When you strip away the frantic back-channel cables and the bruised egos at Supreme Headquarters, a staggering, almost absurd contrast emerges. Inside the warm, heavily guarded rooms of Versailles and Zonhoven, the highest-ranking officers in the Western world had nearly allowed a crisis of personality and poor phrasing to dismantle the combined war effort. Yet, out in the freezing timber of the Ardennes, isolated American infantrymen were actively dismantling the German 5th and 6th Panzer armies. The actual mechanics of the Allied victory were not forged in press conferences or diplomatic apologies. The German war machine was halted by brutal, localized logistics, raw tactical endurance, and the blood of soldiers holding lonely crossroads in the snow. The January command crisis stands as a definitive historical lesson in the reality of coalition warfare. It proves that assembling massive armies and superior technology is only half the battle. When fighting alongside allies, diplomatic tact, emotional intelligence, and the deliberate management of internal friction are just as vital to victory as tactical brilliance on the map. Looking back at the frantic communications of that freezing winter, the most unsettling truth is not how the massive German offensive was ultimately defeated. It is the chilling realization that the greatest military alliance in modern history survived its absolute most dangerous internal threat by a margin of merely a few hours. The deadliest threat to the Allied victory in the freezing winter of 1944 was not just 1,000 German tanks hidden in the Ardennes fog. It was the terrifying reality that a fragile coalition built by millions could be instantly shattered by a few arrogant words spoken behind a microphone.